This is Jed Distler, and welcome to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. And I hope you will consider subscribing to the Piano Maven through our Substack page, and I've provided a link to the Substack page in our episode description. Paid subscribers get all kinds of goodies, such as free download recordings from my archive at the beginning of each month, which usually consist of things you cannot find anywhere else, or theoretically so. And your subscription, your paid subscription, will ensure that we keep this podcast alive and afloat through the rest of the year. So thank you for considering subscribing. Moving on, I'm going to be talking about the jazz pianist, composer, teacher, and bandleader Lennie Tristano in this episode. In an earlier Piano Maven episode, I discussed 10 classical pianists who one might consider to be cult figures. Now, in the world of jazz piano, the artist who I think resides at the top of piano cult figures undoubtedly would have to be Lennie Tristano, who lived from 1919 until 1978. Long before jazz was being taught in conservatories and music schools, Tristano had developed a very thorough and systematic approach to teaching improvisation that applied not only to pianists, but to all instrumentalists in terms of ear training and technique and timekeeping and linear improvisation. And this resulted in generations of students, many of whom were fanatically devoted not just to Tristano's teaching, but even going so far to accepting his opinions on various musicians as gospel. Tristano had a very strong personality and an unswerving focus that one could interpret as being either positive or negative. And I personally found Tristano quite intimidating upon the one personal encounter I had with him when I was considering maybe taking lessons with him. But from what I understand, he could also be quite nurturing and generous with his students. But let's talk about his career and his life. Born blind, Lennie Tristano was raised in Chicago, where he studied at that city's American Conservatory of Music, and he got a bachelor's degree in 1943. Tristano moved to New York in 1946 and became involved in the rapidly developing modern jazz scene, making a name for himself as both pianist and composer. He had a penchant for harmonic experimentation and contrapuntal textures that impressed many musicians and listeners. First in his trio recordings with guitar and bass that he made for the Keystone label in 1946. But Tristano's musical conceptions coalesced even further in the sextet recordings he made for the Capitol label in 1949, and his sidemen featured students and disciples such as alto saxophonist Lee Konitz, tenor saxophonist Warren Marsh, and guitarist Billy Bauer. And these recordings still stand out for their sophisticated themes characterized by great linear invention and a level of ensemble precision that contrasted to the often rough and ready bebop norm on disc. And the Capitol sessions also included 2 selections that were completely improvised from scratch, totally free improvisation. And this is 10 years before Ornette Coleman came onto the scene. In the early 1950s, Tristano experimented with multi-tracking and other forms of tape manipulation with his piano recordings, sometimes achieving rather controversial results in that he might record improvised lines at one tempo and then play them back twice as fast. However, his 1961 solo piano album called The New Tristano, that first came out on the Atlantic label, totally avoids such gimmicks. It's pure, unadulterated solo piano. And the selections reveal a solo style that is either heavily chord-based or else consists of steady walking bass lines in the left hand that support complex right-hand linear improvisations. As Tristano's teaching practice grew in the 1950s and 60s, he increasingly retreated from live performances. And when he did perform in public, it was really quite a rare occasion. And his recording activity became limited to private sessions in his home studio, many of these which were released after his death. I find that the finesse of the 1949 Capitol recordings quite stimulating, and they're really beautiful recordings, although there is a degree of self-awareness and, dare I say, a kind of contrived sensibility that also comes across to my ears. And in the 1954 quartet recordings for Atlantic that Tristano made with Lee Konitz, I tend to find Tristano's accompaniments, how he's supporting Konitz, very heavy-handed and kind of off-putting, with thick pounding chords a lot of the time that seem to be less about giving support than being a stern chaperone, for lack of a better analogy. But the virtuosity and intensity characterizing the solo tracks on the new Tristano still sounds fresh and vital, especially in a really dazzling selection that's called C minor complex, which is based on the harmonic sequence of the song Pennies from Heaven, but in the minor key, the minor mode instead of the major mode. Most of Tristano's thematic lines are based on popular song standards, by the way. For example, the 1949 sextet selection that is called Wow is based on the song You Can Depend on Me, while there's a song by Tristano that's called Lennie Bird, and that's based on How High the Moon. His students similarly followed suit. For example, Warren Marsh came up with some brilliant lines. Like his song Marshmallow is based on Cherokee, and he has a song called Background Music that's really quite sophisticated rhythmically and has all kinds of melodic phrases that just go over the bar lines, and it's called Background Music, and this is based on All of Me, the song All of Me. I actually think that Warren Marsh took Tristano's principles and forged one of the most fluid and subtle and original improvising styles of all tenor saxophonists, whereas Lee Konitz was more of an experimenter and sometimes an outlier, and he could be more unpredictable. The problem that I often have with Tristano and the people who came out of his school is that they always seem to have been focused on the pursuit of the ideal improvised line, while generally ignoring their surroundings in the process and maybe not taking their rhythm section into consideration or thinking about color or dynamics or ensemble textural contrasts. It's often as like when you hear Tristano in some of the recordings with bass and drums, is that he's content to relegate the bass and drums to a mere timekeeping function, and rather than interacting with them. I mean, it's totally the opposite from the 1960s Bill Evans trios, which are basically three-way conversations. And for example, when you listen to the 1960s Miles Davis quintet recordings, it's really akin to sophisticated chamber music where everyone has solo turns, of course, yet the textural and rhythmic variety with which the rhythm section supports the soloists creates a whole different kind of context rather than just mere background timekeeping wallpaper. But with the Tristano disciples, and often with Tristano himself, I guess it's like the analogy I'm thinking about is like a chef who is hell-bent on creating the most perfect sauce without caring so much about how the meal is presented or the sequence of dishes, appetizer, main course, dessert, without that kind of context. It's really all about that ideal sauce. But we do have some amazing isolated examples of Tristano at his most experimental. For instance, there is this multi-tracked piano selection that's called Descent into the Maelstrom. I think it was recorded in 1953. I don't think it was released during Tristano's lifetime. I may be wrong, but it's an extraordinary track because it is full of atonal and thick and restlessly virtuosic piano playing. And it's not unlike the cluster-based piano music of the Russian and Italian futurists, or maybe the American George Antheil in the 1920s with his ballet mécanique. And it often foreshadows Cecil Taylor. I wonder what would have happened if Tristano had pursued these ideas further, or what would have happened had he built upon the potential displayed in the 1949 sextet experiments in free improvisation. But his few solo performances from the 1960s, aside from the album The New Tristano, basically adhere to that walking bass left hand and right hand melodic improvisation model that is displayed in The New Tristano. And these unaccompanied solos are wonderful in and of themselves. Now, one reason that Tristano may have retreated from live performance probably had to do with nightclub conditions and bad pianos and audience noise and things like that. I think he really wanted audiences to come and really pay attention to the music and just have real ideal conditions to make art. And I totally can understand that. Now, would Tristano have performed more had he been granted the conditions that people like Oscar Peterson or Keith Jarrett had when they made their rare nightclub appearances? I'm thinking about when Oscar Peterson played at New York's Blue Note, as well as Keith Jarrett playing at the Blue Note, where the piano would be tuned before each set, and there'd be very strict rules about when drinks could be served, like you couldn't be serving anything during the music or something like that. My sense is that after a certain point in his life, Tristano felt that he could be creative outside of the public arena, and that he could do so on his own terms, and also that I think he genuinely enjoyed teaching and transmitting his ideas to and through young musicians. And also having established a teaching studio in the 1950s that basically flourished for the next 2 decades, Tristano had a relatively secure and stable base of income that really did allow him the luxury of not having to compromise elsewhere in his life. In any case, Lennie Tristano's recorded legacy is a prime example of the value in scarcity, and it kind of parallels classical artists like Carlos Kleiber, the conductor, who only made a handful of commercial recordings, or the pianist Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli, who picked and chose everything he did and probably canceled more concerts than he played. Be that as it may, Lennie Tristano will always be a fascinating figure in jazz history, as a musical thinker, as an educator, as a band leader, and as a remarkable and very individual pianist. This is Jed Distler, and you've been listening to the Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I look forward to being with you for the next episode. Take good care.